She told her friends she kept me in line. She bragged about it at dinner parties, over wine, with that soft laugh she had, the one that curled at the edges. What she never told them was that I was the one who built the knot. My name is Elliot Harwick. I am 62 years old. And for 11 years, I let a woman mistake my silence for weakness. This is the story of the day I stopped being silent. I want you to picture me clearly before we go any further. I'm not a dramatic man. I don't raise my voice in arguments. I don't send angry text messages at midnight. I don't tell people my problems. I go to work. I manage property, a strip of retail units on the east side of Asheville, North Carolina, 2 small office buildings near the airport, a warehouse leased to a logistics company on a long-term contract. It's not glamorous. It's paperwork, maintenance calls, and lease renewals at the kitchen table on Sunday evenings. I wear plain clothes, drive a practical truck, and believe, deeply, in the dignity of doing things correctly and quietly. My father trimmed his own hedges until he was 78 years old, and he never once asked anyone to notice. I am his son. My wife, my second wife, is Nain Harwick, née Stokes. 50 years old. She runs a small arts foundation here in Asheville. She calls herself a cultural curator. She has beautiful taste in furniture, a gift for social performance, and a talent I did not fully understand until a Tuesday evening in October, for turning other people's silence into stories she could use. The light that evening had gone amber, the kind that makes even ordinary things look expensive. I'd come in from checking on a tenant issue at the Marfield units, mud on my boots, folder under my arm, and I was walking through the hallway toward the kitchen when I heard her voice. She was in the sunroom. The French doors pulled halfway shut. A Bluetooth piece in her ear. She wore it like a badge of importance. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I was just walking through my own house. "He's not going anywhere," she said. And laughed. Not a warm laugh. The kind that curls at the edges. I know exactly what keeps him in line. He's too proud to fight it and too smart to call my bluff. I stopped. My hand was still on the hallway wall. She lowered her voice just slightly, not enough. "Dorian, you don't understand. Elliot has history. Old history. And I'm the only one in this town who knows how to frame it." I stood there, 10 seconds, maybe 30, and then I walked the rest of the way to the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of water. I stood at the sink, staring at the backyard. The amber light was gone now. The yard was just dark. Dorian Vale. I knew the name. He'd come around a few times as part of Nain's foundation circle. Tall. Soft-spoken. The kind of man who stands too close when he talks to women and calls it warmth. He'd approached me once about leasing one of my Marfield units for a gallery venture. I'd given him 40 minutes of solid professional advice, free of charge. Apparently, that transaction had gone in a different direction than I'd realized. I rinsed my glass, set it on the rack, and went upstairs to the study. File folder, the envelope. The room name called cluttered. I called mine. On the bottom shelf, behind a row of tax binders, sat a manila envelope I hadn't opened in over 2 decades. I sat down and held it in both hands. Inside was a letter from the Federal Oversight Office. Dated 1999. During a commercial real estate dispute involving a government-adjacent development project, a competitor had filed a misconduct complaint against me. Bid manipulation. Falsified appraisals. All of it, every word of it, false. The investigation closed in 4 months. I was cleared completely. The letter said so in plain language. I never talked about it publicly because I didn't see the point. The matter was resolved. I moved on. But somewhere along the way, Nain had found out about the investigation. And somewhere between finding out and that evening in the sunroom, she had quietly turned it into a weapon. I set the envelope on the desk. Leaned back in the chair. Outside, I could hear her laughing again. That easy, careless sound. The sound of a woman who believed her foundation was solid. She thought she was holding the rope. What she didn't know was that I'd been the one who built the knot. Telephone receiver, the call to Kenneth Crane. I reached for my phone. Scrolled to a contact I hadn't used in 3 years. Kenneth Crane. Attorney. The kind of man who answers on the second ring and never wastes a word. Elliot. Been a while. It has. I need to meet soon. A pause. Brief. Professional. Tomorrow morning. My office. 8 o'clock. I set the phone down. Looked at the envelope again. And felt something settle inside my chest. Not anger. Not grief. Something colder and more useful than either. The game had already started. She just didn't know I'd been holding cards the whole time. Classical building # Ken Crane's office. Ken's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown that smelled like old wood and serious money. No artwork on the walls. No plants on the windowsill. Just law books, a clean desk, and a man who looked like he'd been born wearing a suit. I laid the envelope in front of him without a word. He read the clearance letter twice. Then he set it down, folded his hands, and looked at me the way a doctor looks at an X-ray before delivering news. Who else knows this exists? Nobody. Not even my brother. He tapped the edge of the letter once. She's been using the investigation, not the clearance, as leverage. That's my read. She tells people I had trouble. Lets them fill in the blanks. He leaned back. How wide is the damage? I told him about the phone call. About Dorian Vale. And then I told him about my neighbor Phil Garrett, retired contractor, good man, terrible poker face, who'd stopped me in the driveway 2 days earlier. Hey, Elliot, Phil had started, shifting his weight. I don't want to get in your business, but Nain mentioned something at the Hard Rose cookout last month. Something about a government investigation. Said you'd been through a rough patch years back and that she'd helped you keep it together. He paused. I figured you'd want to know it was making the rounds. I'd thanked him and said it was old news. Walking back inside, I hadn't felt angry. I'd felt something click into place. The quiet, certain feeling of a man who finally understands the shape of the problem he's been living inside. Ken listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, he said flatly, she's been running a narrative. Deliberate. Sustained. Socially distributed. That's not pillow talk. That's a campaign. Then he picked up his pen. What's Dorian Vale's connection to your property dealings? That was the part that still sat sideways in my gut. Vale had used me. Got what he needed from my expertise and walked. And now he was the man my wife called when she wanted to feel understood. Ken looked up from his notepad. That's not a coincidence, Elliot. That's a pattern. We talked for another hour. By the end of it, Ken had a plan. Careful. Measured. Nothing premature. Step 1. Document everything. Dates. Names. What was said and where. Step 2. A quiet audit of every joint financial instrument Nain had access to. Step 3. Wait. Don't tip her off, he said as I stood to leave. Let her keep talking. Every word she says out there is evidence. Ear of rice the drive home. I drove home slowly, taking the long way around the lake. October in Asheville had turned everything copper and rust. The kind of beauty that looks better when you're not carrying weight. I was carrying weight. When I pulled into the driveway, Nain was outside by the mailbox. Cream-colored coat. Phone pressed to her ear. She gave me a small wave and turned slightly away, just enough to signal the call was private. I waved back. Smiled. Went inside. In the study, I pulled out a legal pad and started writing. Names. Dates. What Phil had said. What Nain had said in that sunroom. What I knew about Dorian Vale. The more I wrote, the more I understood. This hadn't started last Tuesday. This had been building for years. Quiet. Incremental. The way water finds the low spots in a foundation. Mobile phone the call from Boyd Stokes. The phone rang around 7. Unknown number. Mr. Harwick. My name is Boyd Stokes. I think you know who I am. I did. He was Nain's first husband. The one she described as volatile and reckless. The cautionary tale she trotted out to explain why she needed to start over. "I won't waste your time," Boyd said. "I heard through someone that things might be shifting in your household. And I thought you might want to hear a few things from someone who's been where you're standing." He exhaled slowly. "She didn't leave me because I was difficult, Mr. Harwick. She left because she'd already decided I wasn't useful anymore. And before she left, she spent 8 months telling everyone I had problems I didn't have." The legal pad was still open in front of me. I picked up the pen. "I'm listening," I told him. Outside, the last of the October light faded behind the ridge. Nain was still on her call. I could see the pale glow of her phone screen through the window, moving slowly across the yard like a lantern in a very small dark. She thought she was the one running this. She hadn't looked up long enough to notice I'd already started moving. "Usted. Hit that like button. It costs you nothing. And it tells me to keep telling stories like this one. The architecture of a lie. Open book recap and re-entry. When we left Elliot at the end of part 1, he'd done something that most men in his position never do. He didn't yell. He didn't confront. He didn't pack a bag and leave. He sat down at a desk. He picked up a pen and started writing names, dates, and patterns. He'd heard from Boyd Stokes, Nain's first husband, and the picture Boyd had painted was not of a difficult man who'd failed a marriage. It was of a woman who needed someone to be failing in order to justify her own importance. "She needs to be the rescuer," Boyd had said. "It's not enough to be loved. She needs to be necessary. And if you're not in trouble, she'll manufacture the trouble." Elliot had thanked him. He'd asked if Boyd would put anything in writing. Boyd said yes without hesitating. And then Elliot called Ken. "We now have a pattern," Ken said when Elliot relayed the conversation. "That's different from a grievance. That's a case. Credit card, the joint account, a quiet performance." That same week, Elliot made a move he'd been thinking about since the night at the kitchen sink. Nain monitored their joint account the way some people monitor the weather, casually, confidently, assuming it would behave the way it always had. Elliot had deposited regularly for years. She spent without consulting him. He had tolerated it because the amounts were manageable and the peace felt worth it. But now he needed her to stop looking. One morning, before she came downstairs, he left 3 things on the kitchen counter. A printed bank statement, showing the joint account balance considerably lower than usual. A handwritten note, called Property Manager Re-Marfield Vacancy Issue. A folder labeled, Q3 Shortfall, Review Needed. None of it was fabricated. The Marfield unit did have a vacancy. Q3 had been slower. He simply arranged the truth to tell a particular story. Then he went to work. He watched from the hallway, reflected faintly in the kitchen window, as Nain came downstairs, picked up the statement, looked at it, set it back down, and said nothing. She refilled her coffee and went to her office. Good. Office building, the LLC, the thread she never pulled. That afternoon, Elliot met with Ken and finalized the transfer of his primary rental income stream into a property management LLC he'd set up 2 years earlier for liability protection. Nain had signed the initial paperwork. She'd been in a hurry that day, some foundation event. She had skimmed 2 pages and written her name in 3 places. The structure gave the LLC full operational control. Her name wasn't on the operating agreement. It never had been. Ken reviewed everything and looked up. She has no claim to the LLC income. The joint account is the only thread she's holding, and you've already started pulling it. "I want to do this right," Elliot told him. "Nothing that looks retaliatory." "It won't," Ken replied. "It'll look exactly like what it is. A man protecting assets he built before, during, and after a marriage to someone who was never his partner. Just his audience. Man #boy Nolan, the son she kept at a distance." Elliot drove home that evening feeling lighter than he had in years. Not happy. Not yet. But clear. He called his son, Nolan. An architect, 34, based in Durham. The best decision Elliot had ever made in his first marriage. Nain had kept Nolan at arm's length from day one. Too much shared history. Too much loyalty to a version of Elliot she hadn't curated. Elliot had let her manage the distance because he believed it was just personality friction. Boyd Stokes had helped him understand what it actually was. Nolan arrived Saturday morning with coffee and no small talk. They sat in the study. Elliot told him everything: the phone call, the clearance letter, Ken Crane, Boyd Stokes, all of it. When he finished, Nolan leaned forward. "The trust," he said. "Is it still structured the way you set it up before you remarried?" "It is. Your name is still the primary beneficiary. Nothing changed." Nolan nodded slowly. "She doesn't know that, does she?" "Not a question." Elliot answered it anyway. "She thinks the house and the rental income are the whole picture. She's never once asked about the trust." Nolan looked at the envelope on the desk, then back at his father with his mother's eyes and his grandfather's jaw. "Then let her keep thinking that," he said quietly, "until it's too late to matter." Artist palette Raymond Chu, the message without words. There was one more move Elliot had been sitting on. Not legal. Not financial. Personal. He found Raymond Chu's name in the donor directory for the Asheville arts community. Raymond was a retired professor, an arts advocate, an independent gallery owner who'd spent 15 years showing emerging local artists without charging them commissions. The kind of work that doesn't generate headlines but matters deeply to the people it serves. Nain had frozen him out of the foundation grant cycle 2 years earlier. Didn't fit the foundation's evolving curatorial vision. Raymond had taken it quietly and moved on. Elliot called him. "I want to sponsor your spring show." Quietly. No fanfare. Just a check that covers your programming costs. A pause. "Why now?" "Because your work deserves support. And because I should have done this 2 years ago instead of staying out of foundation politics." Another pause. "I appreciate that, Mr. Harwick. More than you know." Elliot sent the money that evening. No press release. No announcement. Just a transfer and a handshake over the phone. Word would travel. In the Asheville arts community, it always did. And when it reached Nain's ears that her husband had quietly backed the man she'd publicly sidelined, the message would be clear without a single word ever being addressed to her directly. He was not the man she'd been describing. Open door the confrontation at the doorway. That evening, Nain appeared in the kitchen doorway while Elliot was making dinner. She watched him for a moment. "Raymond Chu called me today." Measured. Trying to read the room. Elliot kept his eyes on the pan. "Did he?" "He mentioned a sponsorship. From you." "The man does good work. Seemed like the right thing." She stood there a moment longer. Recalibrating. "I didn't know you were interested in that side of the arts community." Elliot turned. Looked at her directly. "There's quite a bit you don't know about me, Nain." She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then turned and went back to her office. He returned to cooking. Calm. Unhurried. The pan steady in his hand. The hospital. What she did before she walked in. 3 weeks into November, Elliot was at the Marfield units doing a walkthrough with a prospective tenant when the pressure started. Not pain exactly, more like a weight settling across his chest, spreading into his left shoulder. He recognized it immediately. He'd had a minor cardiac episode 7 years earlier. His cardiologist had been clear about the signals. He told the tenant they'd need to reschedule. Walked to his truck. Drove himself to Mission Hospital. Both hands on the wheel. No music. By the time he reached the ER, the pressure had eased slightly. They admitted him anyway. Nolan arrived within 2 hours. He'd been in Asheville for a client meeting and got Elliot's text before he'd even been moved to a room. He sat in the chair beside the bed, jacket still on, and said, "You drove yourself." The alternative was lying on the floor of a vacant retail unit. He almost smiled. Nain arrived 40 minutes later. She came through the door with the right expression, concern arranged carefully on her face, hand going to Elliot's arm, the appropriate words delivered in the appropriate order. But something was off in the sequence. The way an actor hits the right notes in the wrong rhythm. She pulled one of the nurses aside in the hallway. Elliot could see her through the glass partition. Couldn't hear the words, but could read the posture. The nurse was answering questions. Nain was nodding, phone in hand, typing something as the nurse spoke. The nurse, a no-nonsense woman named Carol, 22 years in the profession, came back into the room afterward to check his monitor. She caught his eyes and held them. "Your wife had some questions." "What kind of questions?" She glanced through the glass. Then back at him. "About your insurance coverage. And about what typically happens with estate decisions when a patient has a cardiac event." Her voice was professionally flat. "I've been doing this job for 22 years, Mr. Harwick. People ask about that stuff. But usually they ask the attending. And usually they wait until the patient is stable." A pause. "She asked before she came in to see you." The room was very quiet. Before she walked through that door, she was already asking about the insurance and the estate. That's not a scared wife. Carol looked at him steadily. That's a woman who's been waiting for an opportunity. Nolan, who had said nothing, slowly set his phone face down on the chair arm. Elliot held Carol's gaze. "Thank you for telling me." She gave a small nod. Made a note on her tablet. Left. The room was quiet for a long moment. "Daddy," Nolan said quietly. "I heard her." "I know," Elliot told him. "I did too." Page facing up, page 7. The tests came back clean. No cardiac event. Elevated stress markers and a warning to slow down. Dr. Ree discharged him the following morning. Nain drove him home. She was attentive. Made tea. Asked twice if he needed anything. All the right moves. That afternoon, while she was on a call, Elliot went to the study and called Ken. She asked about estate decisions before she came into the room. A long pause on Ken's end. "Elliot. That changes our timeline. We need to move faster." "How much faster?" "Everything documented and filed by end of next week. The LLC transfer. The handwriting analysis. Boyd's records. All of it in a formal package before she makes another move." His voice was steady but firm. "You're not just protecting assets anymore. You're protecting yourself." He hung up. Sat in the study with the door closed. The clearance letter on the desk in front of him. Winter light coming flat through the window. He thought about Carol. About the way she'd looked at him, not with pity, but with the clear-eyed recognition of someone who'd seen this particular performance before. He hadn't needed a hospital visit to confirm what he already knew. But sometimes the truth shows itself in ways you weren't expecting. And in places you'd rather not be. Ballpoint pen hashed the initials on page 7. Before the filing, Elliot walked to the cabinet in the corner of the study and pulled the LLC formation documents Nain had signed. He went through every page slowly. On page 7, a notary acknowledgement. The initials in the margin weren't Nain's. They were close, same general shape, but the loop on the end was wrong. He photographed it. Sent it to Ken with one line, "Check the initials on page 7 of the LLC docs." Ken's response came 20 minutes later. Already flagged it. "Good eyes. Don't touch anything." 2 days later, confirmation. A handwriting analyst, overnight review. "The initials aren't hers," Ken said. "Whoever initialed that page was approximating her signature. Not producing it naturally. The pressure patterns are wrong." A pause. "We have falsification of a legal document, Elliot. That's not a divorce argument. That's a crime." Bookmark tabs. Boyd Stokes comes to Asheville. Boyd drove up from Raleigh. They sat in the study, the same room where all of this had begun, and Boyd walked Elliot through the transfer authorization he discovered 2 years after his divorce from Nain. $4,000. From their joint investment account into a personal account she'd opened 6 months before she filed. "My attorney said the amount wasn't worth the fight," Boyd said. "But I kept everything." Elliot looked through the pages carefully. The signature on the authorization was Boyd's, or a version of it. The loop on the lowercase d was slightly too wide. The date stamp was from a Thursday afternoon when Boyd had been supervising a job site in Durham. 3 hours away. You were out of town when this was signed. I have the project receipts. Elliot photographed his documents and sent them to Ken immediately. 2 marriages. 2 different men. Same method. Ken's message came back within the hour. This is exactly what we needed. Don't let him leave town. Just I'm here. That tells me this kind of storytelling matters to you. It matters to me too. The ground shifts, and the quiet that follows. There is a particular kind of mourning that follows the end of something long and heavy. The air is the same. The coffee is the same. The light comes through the window the same way it always has. But you are different. Not louder. Not angrier. Just, finally, fully yourself. This is that morning. Elliot Harwick's story ends the way it began, in silence. But this silence is different. This one is his. Scales # Ken files everything. On a Thursday morning, Kenneth Crane filed everything. The LLC transfer records. The handwriting analysis. Boyd Stokes's corroborating documents. The comparative signature review across 2 marriages. Carol's written account from the hospital. All of it organized into a formal legal package and submitted to the appropriate channels before Nain had finished her morning coffee. Elliot wasn't there for the filing. He was at the Marfield units replacing a broken exterior light with a tenant who'd been patient about it for 2 weeks. Ordinary work. Steady hands. The kind of mourning that doesn't announce itself. Ken called at 11:15. It's done. Everything is on record. If Forsyth calls you directly, say nothing. Refer him to me. Understood. One more thing. A pause. I sent a courtesy notice to Gerald Forsyth this morning. Standard language. Formal notification that you've retained counsel and that all communication should be directed accordingly. No details. No accusations. Just a signal that the landscape has changed. Elliot understood what that signal would produce. Forsyth would go to Nain. Nain would ask what it meant. And Forsyth, being a thorough attorney, would start pulling threads. Which meant he'd eventually pull the thread that led to the clearance letter, the handwriting analysis, and Boyd Stokes. Face without mouth the silence on Forsyth's end. That process took 4 days. The call came on a Monday, not from Forsyth, but from Nain's cell phone. Elliot let it ring to voicemail. She didn't leave a message. 20 minutes later, Forsyth called Ken. Ken relayed the conversation word for word, the way he always did. Precise. Without editorializing. Forsyth had opened with the standard framing, concerns about the asset restructuring, questions about the LLC documentation, a desire to understand the timeline of transfers. Routine opening moves. Then Ken had sent in the package. The silence on Forsyth's end lasted nearly 8 seconds. Where did this handwriting analysis come from? A certified forensic examiner. The report is on page 11. Another pause. The second set of documents, the records from a previous marriage. Page 19. With accompanying travel records and dated receipts. Forsyth's voice shifted somewhere in the middle of that exchange. Not dramatically, but perceptibly. The way a man's voice shifts when he realizes he's been handed a case he didn't sign up for. She said you were the one with history. She had the clearance letter for 4 years, Ken replied. She chose to mention only the investigation, not the outcome. The call ended shortly after. Place setting # the dinner table conversation. Elliot was sitting in the study when Ken finished telling him. The room was quiet, the lamp throwing a narrow pool of light across the desk. He didn't feel triumph. He felt something more like the end of a long drive, the moment you put the car in park and just sit for a second before going inside. Nain came home that evening at 7. She moved through the kitchen without her usual ease. There was a stiffness in her. A contained quality, like a woman holding something she didn't want to spill. She made dinner without speaking much. Elliot helped without being asked. Over the meal, she looked at him once with an expression he hadn't seen from her before. Not anger, Not calculation. Something that might have been the early edge of fear. Gerald called me today, she said finally. I know, he replied. She set her fork down. You should have told me. Elliot looked at her steadily. You should have told me. 4 years ago, when you found that letter, you should have read it all the way through and told me what you found. She opened her mouth. Then closed it. But you didn't. You read just enough to build something with. And then you used it in front of our neighbors, our friends, people I've worked with for years. You turned my silence into a story about your sacrifice. He picked up his glass. That's not a misunderstanding, Nain. That's a choice. She said nothing for a long time. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, wind moved through the yard. What happens now? Now Gerald talks to Ken. And you listen to what Gerald tells you. He finished his dinner, washed his plate, and went back to the study. Behind him, he heard her sit at the table for a long time without moving. The ground had shifted. She could feel it now. Handshake the luncheon. Be visible. Let people see the man. 3 days later, Elliot walked into the Asheville Business Coalition's annual November luncheon at the Omni Grove Park in a navy suit and the particular kind of calm that only comes from having nothing left to hide. Go be visible, Ken had said the day before. Let people see the man. Not the story. So he went. The room was full, 120 people, tables of 8. He knew perhaps 60 of them. Nodded to a dozen on the way to his seat. Ordered water. Let the room come to him. It did. Phil Garrett stopped by between courses. Then Harriet Bloom from the Downtown Development Board. Then a commercial broker named Ted Winslow who'd sent 2 tenants his way over the years. Each of them engaged with Elliot the way people engage with someone they've been hearing about and are now recalibrating against the original.